The second lecture is entitled, What Difference Does It Make If God Exists? Jan and I were living in Belgium when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Iron Curtain fell. It was an exciting time to be lecturing on university campuses across Europe when such historic, world-changing events were happening before our very eyes. On one trip to St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad, shortly after the change, I visited the famous Russian cosmologist Andrei Grib, who is a Christian believer. And as we strolled through the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, looking at its splendid treasures from Russia's Tsarist past, I asked Andrei about the turning to God in Russia that had followed immediately upon the fall of communism. Well, he said to me, in mathematics we have something called proof by the opposite. You can prove something is true by showing its opposite is false. For 70 years we have tried Marxist atheism in this country, and it didn't work, so everybody figured the opposite must be true. Part of the challenge of getting American people to think about God is that they've become so used to God that they just take him for granted. They never think to ask what the implications would be if God did not exist. And as a result, they think that God is irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether God exists or not. So before we share with people evidence for God's existence, we may need to help them to see why it matters in the first place. Otherwise, they just won't care. By showing them the implications of atheism, we can help them to see that the question of God's existence is so much more than merely adding one more item to our inventory of things, adding God to your inventory of things that exist. Rather, it's an issue that lies at the very core of life's meaning, and it therefore touches each of us at the center of our being. Professor Grib's proof by the opposite is also known as reductio ad absurdum, or reducing something to absurdity. And I think this label is especially appropriate when it comes to atheism. For many philosophers, such as the French existentialists Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, have argued that if God does not exist, then life is indeed absurd. Now, admittedly, Sartre and Camus did not take this to be a proof of the opposite, namely that God exists. Rather, they concluded that life really is absurd. Nevertheless, their analysis of human existence, I think, shows us clearly the grim implications of atheism. So the absurdity of life without God may not prove that God exists, but it does show that the question of God's existence is the most important question that a person can ask. No one who truly grasps the implications of atheism can say whatever when it comes to whether or not there is a God. Now, when I use the word God in this context, I mean an all-powerful, perfectly good creator of the world who offers us eternal life. If such a God does not exist, then life is absurd. That is to say, life would have no ultimate meaning, value, or purpose. These three notions, meaning, value, purpose, though closely related, are distinct. Meaning has to do with significance, why something matters. Value has to do with good and evil, right and wrong. Purpose has to do with goal, with a reason for something. And my claim is that if there is no God, then meaning, value, and purpose are ultimately human illusions. They're just in our heads. If atheism is true, then life is really, objectively meaningless, valueless, and purposeless, despite our subjective beliefs to the contrary. Now, this point, I think, is worth underscoring because it's so frequently misunderstood. I am not saying that atheists experience life as dull and meaningless, that they have no personal values, or that they lead immoral lives, that they have no goals or purpose for living. On the contrary, life would be unbearable and unlivable without such beliefs. My point, rather, is that on atheism, such beliefs are all subjective illusions, the appearance of meaning, value, and purpose, even though objectively speaking, there isn't any. If God does not exist, our lives are ultimately meaningless, valueless, and purposeless, despite how desperately we cling to the illusion to the contrary. Now, what do I mean by objective? Well, something is objective if it's real or true, independent of anybody's opinion about it. So, for example, water is H2O is an objective fact. It's true, independent of anybody's opinion. Something is subjective if it's just a matter of personal opinion. Vanilla tastes better than chocolate is subjective. It's a matter of your opinion. And you can keep these two terms straight by remembering that objective is like an object that is really there, whereas subjective is like a subject or person on whose opinion something depends. And my contention is that if God does not exist, then life is objectively absurd. For if God does not exist, then both man and the universe are inevitably doomed to death. Man, like all biological organisms, must die. With no hope of immortality, man's life leads only to the grave. His life is but a spark in the infinite blackness, a spark that appears, flickers, and dies forever. And therefore, everyone must come face to face with what theologian Paul Tillich called the threat of non-being. For though I know that I exist, that I am alive, I also know that someday I will die, that I will no longer be. And this thought is staggering and threatening, to think that the person that I call I, myself, will cease to exist, that I will be no more. I can remember vividly the first time that my father told me as a child that someday I would die. Somehow, as a little boy, the thought had just never occurred to me. And when he told me, I was filled with unbearable sadness and fear. And though he tried repeatedly to assure me that this was a long way off, somehow that just didn't matter. For sooner or later, the undeniable fact was that I was going to die. And that fact just overwhelmed me. Eventually, like all of us, I simply soon grew to accept the fact. We all learned to live with the inevitable. But the child's insight remains true. As the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre observed, several hours or several years make no difference once you have lost eternity. And the universe, too, faces a death of its own. Scientists tell us that the universe is expanding, and the galaxies are growing further and further apart. As it does so, it grows colder and colder as its energy is used up. Eventually, all the stars will burn out, and all matter will collapse into dead stars and black holes. There will be no light. There will be no heat. There will be no life. Only the corpses of dead stars and galaxies ever expanding into the endless darkness and the cold recesses of space. A universe in ruins. This is not science fiction. This is really going to happen. As indescribable, as unbelievable as it is, this is really going to happen unless God intervenes first. So not only is the life of each individual person doomed, the entire human race, the whole edifice and accomplishment of human civilization is doomed. Like prisoners condemned to death, we await our unavoidable execution. There is no escape. There is no hope. And what is the consequence of this? It means that life itself becomes absurd. It means that the life that we do have is without ultimate significance, value, or purpose. Let's look at each one of these in turn. First, no ultimate meaning. If each individual person passes out of existence when he dies, then what ultimate meaning can be given to his life? Does it really matter whether he ever existed at all? Now, certainly his life might be important relative to certain other events. But what's the ultimate significance of any of those events? If everything is doomed to destruction, then what difference does it make if you've influenced anything? Ultimately, it makes no difference. Mankind is thus no more significant than a swarm of mosquitoes or a barnyard of pigs, for their end is all the same blind cosmic process that coughed them all up in the first place will eventually swallow them all up again. And thus the contributions of the scientist to the advance of human knowledge, the researches of the doctor to alleviate pain and suffering, the efforts of the diplomat to secure peace in the world, the sacrifices of good people everywhere to better the lot of the human race, all of these come to nothing. This is the horror of modern man. Because he ends in nothing, he is nothing. But it's important to see that it's not just immortality that man needs if life is to be meaningful. Mere duration of existence doesn't make that existence meaningful. If man and the universe could exist forever, but if there were no God, then their existence would still have no ultimate significance. To illustrate, I read a science fiction story once in which an astronaut was marooned on a barren chunk of rock lost somewhere in outer space. And he had with him two vials, one containing poison and the other a potion that would make him live forever. And realizing his predicament, he gulped down the poison. And then, to his horror, he discovered that he had swallowed the wrong vial. He had drunk the potion for immortality. And that meant that he was cursed to exist forever, a meaningless, unending life. Now, if God does not exist, then our lives are just like that. They could go on and on and on and still be utterly without meaning. We could still ask of life, so what? So it's not just immortality that man needs if life is to be ultimately significant. He needs God and immortality. And if God does not exist, then he has neither. And thus, if there is no God, then life itself becomes meaningless. Man and the universe are without ultimate significance. Secondly, no ultimate value. If life ends at the grave, then it makes no ultimate difference whether you live as a Stalin or as a Mother Teresa, since your destiny is ultimately unrelated to your behavior. You may as well just live as you please. As the Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky put it, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. The state torturers in Soviet prisons understood this fact all too well. Richard Wurmbrandt, a pastor who was tortured for his faith, reports, "The cruelty of atheism is hard to believe when man has no faith in the reward of good and the punishment of evil. There is no reason to be human. There is no restraint from the depths of evil which is in man. The communist torturers often said, 'There is no God, no hereafter, no punishment for evil. We can do what we wish.' I have heard one torturer even say, 'I thank God, in whom I don't believe, that I have lived this hour when I can express all the evil in my heart. He expressed it in unbelievable brutality and torture inflicted on prisoners. Given the finality of death, it really does not matter how you live. So what do you say to someone who concludes that we may as well just live as we please out of pure self-interest? Now, somebody might say that it's in our best self-interest to adopt a moral lifestyle. You scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours. But clearly that's not always true. We all know situations in which self-interest runs smack dab in the face of morality. Moreover, if you're sufficiently powerful, like a Ferdinand Marcos or a Papadoc Duvalier or even a Donald Trump, then you can pretty much ignore the dictates of conscience and safely live in self-indulgence. Historian Stuart C. Easton sums it up well when he writes, "There is no objective reason why man should be moral, unless morality pays off in his social life or makes him feel good. There is no objective reason why man should do anything, save for the pleasure it affords him." But the problem becomes even worse, for regardless of immortality, if there is no God, then there is no objective standard of right and wrong. All we're confronted with, in Jean-Paul Sartre's words, is the bare, valueless fact of existence. Moral values are either just expressions of personal taste or else the byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning. After all, on the atheistic view, there's nothing special about human beings. They're just accidental byproducts of nature which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe and which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why, on atheism, is he mistaken when he says, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. In a world without God, who's to say whose values are right and whose are wrong? There can be no objective right and wrong, only our culturally and personally relative subjective judgments. Now think of what that means. That means that it is impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil, nor can you praise generosity, self-sacrifice, and love as good. To kill someone or to love someone is morally equivalent. For in a universe without God, good and evil do not exist. There is only the bare, valueless fact of existence, and there is no one to say that you are right and I am wrong. Finally, no ultimate purpose. If death stands with open arms at the end of life's trail, then what is the goal of life? Is it all for nothing? Is there no reason for life? And what of the universe? Is it utterly pointless? If its destiny is a cold grave in the recesses of outer space, then the answer must be yes, it is pointless. There is no goal, no purpose for the universe. The litter of a dead universe will just go on expanding and expanding forever. And what of man? Is there no purpose at all for the human race? Or will it simply peter out someday, lost in the oblivion of an indifferent universe? The English writer H.G. Wells foresaw such a prospect. In his novel, The Time Machine, Wells' time traveler journeys into the far future to discover the ultimate destiny of man. And all he finds is a dead earth, except for a few lichens and moss orbiting a gigantic red sun. The only sounds are the rush of the wind and the gentle ripple of the sea. Beyond these lifeless sounds, writes Wells, the world was silent. Silent it would be hard to convey the stillness of it. All the sounds of man, the bleating of sheep, the cries of birds, the hum of insects, the stir that makes the background of our lives, all that was over. And so Wells, time traveler, returned. But to what? To merely an earlier point on the same purposeless rush towards oblivion. When, as a non-Christian, I first read Wells's book, I thought, no, it can't end that way. But if there is no God, it will end that way. This is reality in a universe without God, like it or not. There is no hope. There is no purpose. And what is true of mankind as a whole is true of each of us individually. We are here to no purpose. If there is no God, then your life is not qualitatively different from that of an animal. As the ancient writer of Ecclesiastes put it, the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage of man over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place, all are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. In this work, which reads more like a piece of modern existentialist literature than a book from the Bible, the author shows the futility of pleasure, wealth, education, political fame, and honor in a life that is doomed to end in death. His verdict, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. If life ends at the grave, then we have no ultimate purpose for living. But more than that, even if life did not end in death, without God, life would still be without purpose. For man and the universe would then be simply accidents of chance, thrust into existence for no reason. Without God, the universe is the result of a cosmic accident, a chance explosion. There is no reason for which it exists. As for man, he's a freak of nature, a blind product of matter plus time plus chance. If God does not exist, then you are just a miscarriage of nature thrust into a purposeless universe to live a purposeless life. So if God does not exist, that means that man and the universe exist to no purpose, since the end of everything is death, and that they came to be for no purpose, since they are only blind products of chance. In short, life is ultimately and utterly without reason. Now, I hope you begin to understand the gravity of the alternatives before us. For if God exists, then there is hope for man. But if God does not exist, then all we are left with is despair. As one writer has aptly put it, if God is dead, then man is dead too. Unfortunately, most people don't realize this fact. They continue on as though nothing had changed. I'm reminded of the story told by the 19th century atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche of a madman who, in the early morning hours, burst into the marketplace, lantern in hand, crying, "I seek God! I seek God!" Since many of those standing about did not believe in God, he provoked much laughter. "Did God get lost?" they yelled. "Or is he hiding? Or maybe he's gone on a voyage or emigrated," and thus they yelled and laughed. And then, writes Nietzsche, the madman turned in their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night and more night coming on all the while? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? God is dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves?" The crowd stared at the madman in astonishment and silence. And at last he dashed his lantern to the ground. "I have come too early," he said. "This tremendous event is yet on its way. It has not yet reached the ears of men." People did not yet comprehend the consequences of the death of God. But Nietzsche predicted that someday people would understand the implications of atheism, and this realization would usher in an age of nihilism, that is to say, the destruction of all meaning and value in life. Most people still do not reflect upon the consequences of atheism, and so, like the crowd in Nietzsche's marketplace, go unknowingly on their way. But when we realize, as did Nietzsche, what atheism implies, then his question presses hard upon us. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? Well, about the only solution that the atheist can offer is that we simply face the absurdity of life and live bravely. The British philosopher Bertrand Russell, for example, believed that we have no choice but to build our lives upon what he called the firm foundation of unyielding despair. Only by recognizing that the world really is a terrible place can we successfully come to terms with life. Camus said that we should honestly recognize life's absurdity and then live in love for one another. The fundamental problem with this solution, however, is that it's impossible to live consistently and happily within the framework of such a worldview. If you live consistently, then you will not be happy. On the other hand, if you live happily, it is only because you are not consistent. Francis Schaeffer explained this point well. Modern man, said Schaeffer, lives in a two-story universe. In the lower story is the finite world without God. Here, life is absurd, as we've seen. In the upper story are meaning, value, and purpose. Now, modern man lives in the lower story because he believes that there is no God. But he cannot live happily in such an absurd world. And therefore, he continually makes leaps of faith to the upper story to affirm meaning, value, and purpose, even though he has no right to, since he does not believe in God. Let's look again then at each of those three areas in which we saw that life is absurd without God, to see how difficult it is to live consistently and happily within the framework of an atheistic worldview. First, the area of meaning in life. We saw that without God, life has no ultimate meaning. And yet, philosophers continue to live as though life does have meaning. For example, Sartre argued that one may create meaning for his life by freely choosing a certain course of action. Sartre himself chose Marxism. Now, this is totally inconsistent. It is inconsistent to say that life is objectively absurd and then to say that you may create meaning for your life. For if life is really absurd, then you're trapped in the lower story. To try to create meaning in life represents a leap to the upper story. But Sartre has no basis for this leap. Sartre's program is actually an exercise in self-delusion. For the universe doesn't really acquire a meaning just because I happen to give it one. I think this is easy to see. For suppose I give the universe one meaning and you give it another. Who's right? Well, the answer, of course, is neither one. For the universe without God remains objectively meaningless, regardless of how we happen to regard it. Sartre is really saying, let's pretend that the universe has meaning. And that, of course, is just fooling yourself. The point is this: if God does not exist, then life is objectively meaningless. But man cannot live consistently and happily knowing that his life is meaningless. So, in order to be happy, he pretends that life has meaning. But this is, of course, entirely inconsistent, for without God, man and the universe are without any real significance. Turn now to the problem of value in life. Here is where the most blatant inconsistencies occur. First of all, atheistic humanists are totally inconsistent in affirming the values of love and human brotherhood. Camus has been rightly criticized for inconsistently holding both to the absurdity of life on the one hand and to the ethics of human love and brotherhood on the other. The view that there are no values is logically incompatible with affirming the values of love and brotherhood. Bertrand Russell, too, was inconsistent, for even though he was an atheist, he was an outspoken social critic, denouncing war and restrictions on sexual freedom. Russell admitted that he could not live as though ethical values were simply a matter of personal taste, and that he therefore found his own views, and I quote, incredible. I do not know the solution, he confessed. The point is that if there is no God, then objective right and wrong do not exist. As Dostoevsky said, all things are permitted. But man cannot live this way, and so he makes a leap of faith and affirms values anyway. And when he does so, he reveals the inadequacy of a world without God. The horror of a world devoid of value was brought home to me with new intensity several years ago as I watched a BBC television documentary entitled The Gathering. It concerned the reunion of survivors of the Holocaust in Jerusalem, where they rediscovered lost friendships and shared their experiences. One former prisoner, a nurse, told of how she was made the gynecologist at Auschwitz. She observed that pregnant women were grouped together by the soldiers under the direction of Dr. Mengele and housed in the same barracks. Some time passed, and she noticed that she no longer saw any of these women. She made inquiries. Where are the pregnant women that were housed in that barracks? Oh, haven't you heard? Came the reply. Dr. Mengele used them for vivisection. Another woman told of how Mengele had bound up her breasts so that she couldn't suckle her infant. The doctor wanted to know how long an infant could survive without nourishment. Desperately, this poor woman tried to keep her baby alive by feeding it bits of bread soaked in coffee, but to no avail. Each day the baby lost weight, a fact which was eagerly monitored by Dr. Mengele. A nurse then came secretly to this woman and told her, I've arranged a way for you to get out of here, but you cannot take your baby with you. I brought a morphine injection for you to take your child's life. When the woman protested, the nurse was insistent. Look, your baby is going to die anyway. You may as well save yourself. And so this poor mother felt compelled to take the life of her own baby. Dr. Mengele was furious when he learned of it because he had lost his experimental specimen, and he searched among the dead to find the baby's corpse so that he could have one last weighing. My heart was torn when I listened to these stories. One rabbi who survived the camp said it was as though at Auschwitz there existed a world in which all of the 10 commandments were reversed. Thou shalt kill, thou shalt lie, thou shalt steal. Mankind has never seen such a hell. And yet, if God does not exist, then in a very real sense, our world is Auschwitz. There is no objective right and wrong. All things are permitted. But no atheist, no agnostic can live consistently with such a worldview. Nietzsche himself, who proclaimed the necessity of living beyond good and evil, broke with his mentor, Richard Wagner, precisely over the composer's strident German nationalism and anti-Semitism. Similarly, Sartre, writing in the aftermath of the Second World War, condemned anti-Semitism, declaring that a doctrine that leads to mass extermination is not merely an opinion or a matter of personal taste of equal value with its opposite. In his important essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, Sartre struggles vainly to elude the contradiction between his denial of God-given pre-established values and his urgent desire to affirm the value of human persons. Like Russell, he could not live with the implications of his own denial of ethical absolutes. And neither can the so-called new atheists, like Richard Dawkins. For although he says that there is no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference, Dawkins is an unabashed moralist. He vigorously condemns actions such as the harassment and abuse of homosexuals, the religious indoctrination of children, the Incan practice of human sacrifice, the practice of prizing cultural diversity over the interests of Amish children. He even goes so far as to give his own version of the Ten Commandments for guiding moral behavior, all the while marvelously oblivious to the contradiction with his ethical subjectivism. In fact, I think one will never find an atheist who lives consistently with his system, for a universe without moral accountability and devoid of value is unimaginably terrible. Finally, let's look at the problem of purpose in life. The only way most people who deny purpose in life live happily is either by making up some purpose for their life, which amounts to self-delusion, as we saw with Sartre, or else by not carrying their view out to its logical conclusions. The temptation to invest one's own petty plans and projects with objective significance and thereby to find some purpose to one's life is almost irresistible. For example, the outspoken atheist and Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg, at the close of his much-acclaimed book, The First 3 Minutes, writes as follows: "It is an almost irresistible tendency for humans to believe that we have some special relation to the universe, that human life is not a more or less farcical outcome of a chain of accidents reaching back to the first 3 minutes, but that somehow we were built in from the beginning. It is very hard to realize that this is all just a tiny part of an overwhelmingly hostile universe. It is even harder to realize that this present universe has evolved from an unspeakably unfamiliar early condition and faces a future extinction of endless cold or intolerable heat. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But if there is no solace in the fruits of our research, there is at least some consolation in the research itself. Men and women are not content to comfort themselves with tales of gods and giants, or to confine their thoughts to the daily affairs of life. They also build telescopes and satellites and accelerators and sit at their desks for endless hours working out the meaning of the data they gather. The effort to understand the universe is one of the very few things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce and gives it some of the grace of tragedy." There's something strange about Weinberg's moving description of the human predicament. Tragedy is an evaluative term. Weinberg sees the pursuit of scientific research as raising human life above the level of farce to the level of tragedy. Weinberg evidently sees a life devoted to scientific pursuits as truly meaningful, and therefore it's too bad that such a noble pursuit should be exterminated. But why, on atheism, should the pursuit of science be any different from slouching about, doing nothing? Since there is no objective purpose to human life, none of our pursuits has any objective significance, however important and dear they may seem to us subjectively. They are no more significant than shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. The dilemma of modern man is thus truly terrible. The atheistic worldview is insufficient to maintain a happy and consistent life. Man cannot live consistently and happily as though life were ultimately without meaning, value, or purpose. If we try to live consistently within the atheistic worldview, we shall find ourselves profoundly unhappy. If instead we manage to live happily, it is only by giving the lie to our worldview. Confronted with this dilemma, modern man flounders pathetically for some means of escape. In a remarkable address to the American Academy for the Advancement of Science in 1991, Dr. L.D. Rue, confronted with the predicament of modern man, boldly advocated that we deceive ourselves by means of some noble lie into thinking that we and the universe still have value. According to Rue, the lesson of the past 2 centuries is that intellectual and moral relativism is profoundly the case. He says that the consequence of this realization is that the quest for self-fulfillment and the quest for social coherence fall apart. This is because, on the view of relativism, the search for self-fulfillment becomes radically privatized. Each person chooses his own set of values and meaning. So, what are we to do? Rue says there is, on the one hand, the madhouse option, where self-fulfillment is pursued regardless of social coherence. On the other hand, there is the totalitarian option, where social coherence is imposed at the expense of self-fulfillment. If we're to avoid these 2 options, he says, we have no choice but to embrace some noble lie that will inspire us to live beyond selfish interests and so voluntarily achieve social coherence. A noble lie is one that deceives us, tricks us, compels us beyond self-interest, beyond ego, beyond family, nation, and race. It is a lie because it tells us that the universe is infused with value, which is a great fiction, because it makes a claim to universal truth where there is none, and because it tells me not to live for self-interest, which is evidently false. But without such lies, says Rue, we cannot live. This is the dreadful verdict pronounced over modern man. In order to survive, he must live in self-deception. The absurdity of life is more than just an academic affair. It touches us at the very core of our being. I know, for as a teenager I felt deeply the meaninglessness of life and the despair that it brings. Although I had been raised in a good and loving home, we weren't a church-going family, much less a Christian family. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask the big questions in life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And in the search for answers, I began to attend a church in our local community. But instead of answers, all I found was a social country club where the dues were $1 a week in the offering plate. And the other high school students who were involved in the youth group and claimed to be such good Christians on Sunday lived for their real God the rest of the week, which was popularity. And they seemed to be willing to do anything to do anything that it took to be popular. And that really bothered me. They claim to be Christians, I thought, and yet externally, at least, I'm leading a better life than they are. And yet I feel so empty inside. They must be just as empty as I am, but they're all pretending to be something they're not. They're all just a pack of hypocrites. And so I began to grow very bitter toward the institutional church and the people in it. And in time, this attitude began to spread toward other people. Nobody is really genuine, I thought. They're all just a bunch of phonies. Everyone is holding up a plastic mask to the world, while the real person is cowering down inside, afraid to come out and be real. And so my anger and resentment spread from people in the church to people in general. I grew to despise people. I wanted nothing to do with them. I don't need people, I thought, and I threw myself into my studies. Frankly, I was on my way toward becoming a very alienated young man. And yet, in moments of honesty and introspection, I knew deep down inside that I really did want to love and to be loved by others. And I realized in that moment that I was just as much a phony as they were. For here I was pretending not to need people, when deep down inside I knew that I really did. And so that anger and hatred that I felt toward others turned in upon myself for my own phoniness and hypocrisy. I don't know if you understand what this is like, but this kind of inner anger just eats away at your insides day after day, making every day miserable, another day to get through. I couldn't see any purpose to my existence. Nothing really mattered. Everything was black. And one day when I was feeling particularly crummy, I walked into my high school German class, and I sat down behind a girl who is one of these types, you know, that is always so happy it just makes you sick. And I tapped her on the shoulder, and she turned around, and I said to her, "Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway?" And she said, "Well, Bill, it's because I'm saved." And I said, "You're what?" And she said, "I know Jesus Christ is my personal Savior." And I said, "Well, I go to church." And she said, "That's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him really living in your heart." And I said, "Well, what would he want to do a thing like that for?" And she said, "Because he loves you, Bill." And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was so filled with anger and hate, and she said there was someone who really loved me. And who was it but the God of the universe? And that thought just staggered me, to think that the God of the universe could love me, that worm named Bill Craig down there on that speck of dust called planet Earth. I just couldn't take it in. Well, that began for me the most agonizing period of soul searching that I've ever been through in my life. I got a New Testament, and I read it from cover to cover. And as I did, I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a wisdom about his teaching that I had never encountered before. And there was an authenticity about this man's life that wasn't characteristic of those people who claimed to be his followers in that local church I was attending. And I knew then that I couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, meanwhile, Sandy introduced me to other Christians in the high school. And I had never met people like this. No matter what they said about Jesus, what was undeniable was that they were living life on a different plane of reality that I didn't even dream existed. A reality that imparted a deep meaning and joy to their lives, which I craved. Well, to make a long story short, my search went on for about 6 months. I attended Christian meetings, I read Christian books, I sought God in prayer. And finally one evening, about 8 o'clock at night, I just came to the end of myself, and I just cried out to God. And I cried out all the anger and the bitterness that had built up inside of me. And as I did so, I felt at the same time this tremendous infusion of joy, like a balloon being blown up until it was ready to burst. I remember I rushed outside. It was a clear Midwestern summer night, and you could see the Milky Way from horizon to horizon. And I looked up at the stars, and I thought, God, I've come to know God. And that moment changed my entire life. You see, I had thought enough about this message during those 6 months to realize that if this were really the truth, if it were really the truth, then I could do nothing less than spend my entire life spreading this wonderful message among mankind. For many Christians, the main difference that they find in coming to know Christ is the love or the joy or the peace that it brings. And all of those things were important to me too. But if you were to ask me the main difference that Christ has made in my life, without hesitation, I would say meaning. I knew the blackness, the despair of a life lived apart from God. Knowing God suddenly brought eternal significance into my life. Now the things that I did were charged with eternal meaning. Now my life mattered. Now every day I could wake up to another day of walking with Him. Biblical Christianity thus challenges the worldview of modern man. For according to the Christian worldview, God does exist, and life does not end at the grave. Biblical Christianity therefore provides the two conditions necessary for a meaningful, valuable, and purposeful life: God and immortality. Because of this, we can live consistently and happily within the framework of this worldview. And thus, biblical Christianity succeeds precisely where atheism breaks down. Now, admittedly, none of this shows that biblical Christianity is true. The atheist might smugly say that I have embraced a noble lie and am just self-deceived. And so we'll need to examine the arguments for and against the existence of God today and tomorrow. But for the time being, I think at least what we have done is to clearly spell out the alternatives. If God does not exist, then life is futile. If God does exist, then life is meaningful. Only the second of these two alternatives enables us to live life happily and consistently. And therefore, it makes a huge difference whether or not God exists. And thus it seems to me that even if the evidence for these two options were absolutely equal, the rational person ought to believe in God. That is to say, it seems to me that if the evidence is equal, then it is positively irrational to prefer death, futility, and despair to meaningfulness, life, and happiness. As Pascal said, we have nothing to lose and infinity to gain. But my goal in this lecture is actually more modest than that. By sharing the absurdity of life without God, my hope is simply to get people to think about these issues, to realize that the question of God's existence has profound consequences for our lives, and that therefore we can't afford to be indifferent about it. And if we can achieve that much, I think, in sharing with an unbeliever, then we are well on our way. All right, I'll take any questions now that you have over this section. Yes.
I think this is just one of the most powerful arguments. It always hits me very strong. But we live in an age where, postmodernism, you hear a lot, where they don't seem to mind inconsistencies, don't mind self-delusion, they'll admit it, they don't mind contradictions. They seem to, that's fine, what's your point? When you bring that up. Or even Sartre, when his students said, you're being inconsistent, because I think he signed the Algerian Manifesto, and his comment was, life is absurd, but I must pretend it is not. I mean, he admitted it. Or Camus said, the choice is either suicide or live in the face of absurdity, and he decided to live in the face of absurdity and just go on. When a person reaches that point and they admit it and they say, I'm just going to make up meaning, and they use the word, I have meaning in life rather than of life, ultimately there is no meaning, admit it, where do you go from there?
Yeah. I think that most people we talk to won't go that far, that they still do think that, for example, it is really wrong to torture a little child, or that intolerance is really wrong. I find that if you push folks that you will find that they will make an affirmation of objective meaning or value or purpose. But with someone who is content to say, yes, life is absurd, and I simply choose to live inconsistently, I don't see how you can go any further with a person like that except to say that isn't this at least good reason to re-examine your worldview to see if there isn't a worldview that is consistent and is livable and would give you these things so that you don't have to live in self-deception. This person is probably presupposing that there aren't any good reasons to believe in God, or there are good reasons to think that atheism is true. And I think we can perhaps go on to discuss those reasons with such a person to show them that this sort of inconsistency isn't necessary, that they don't have to live this sort of admittedly inconsistent life, that we can offer them something better. And that's about the best I can do at that point, I think.
Two quick points. One is, I think I saw a little clip recently from Richard Dawkins where one of his associates is looking so enraged and offended about people who claim some religious belief deciding to blow themselves up and kill a bunch of innocent people in the process, and using that as a basis of claiming that all religion should be abolished because it wreaks such evil. And when I hear that, I wonder, so where is their standard that they're appealing to claim that that in fact is an evil act? And what does it cause them to be so outraged over it? That's the first. I wonder if you could comment on that. But secondly, it seems to me that when people like Dawkins and other new atheists are so adamant in contending against religion or people of faith, what they're really wanting to cling so desperately to is their own self-determination, their own autonomy that allows them to avoid any moral accountability to a higher authority. I wonder if you would comment on those
Well,
two.
with respect to the first question, I agree with you, and it's worse than what you said. It's not simply that they lack a basis for the moral values that they affirm, but that they explicitly deny that there is any such basis. Remember the quotation I read from Dawkins that says there is no good and evil, morality is just a human illusion. So they are explicitly in contradiction with themselves, and it's a deep, deep existential dilemma for anybody who comes to see it clearly. With respect to the second point, I think it's better as Christian apologists that we not speculate upon the psychological motivations of people like this, to say that they're attempting to just rationalize things and or trying to live an immoral lifestyle or self-autonomy. I think it's better to just avoid that, because that smacks of being personally judgmental, of psychoanalyzing them when we have no business doing that. So I try to prescind from those kinds of personal judgments and stick to the arguments and simply argue that on atheism there is no objective meaning, value, or purpose in life, but that sort of worldview is impossible to live consistently and happily. And I think that that's enough. Mm-hmm.
Describing the time machine in that context where the future would hold just nothing. So in this life is all that a person would have. This is the question that came to my mind. A person would be thinking along this idea that our future after we die here, there is no immortality of the soul. It's just oblivion.
Yes.
What if somebody were to say that that's a better option than to live eternally in a miserable suffering state called hell, according to Christianity?
I agree that that would be better. I think we could all agree it would be better to be annihilated than to be in hell. And that's why some people adopt annihilationism, who want to safeguard God's compassion. But that's not the argument. The question is, what is a necessary condition for the meaningfulness of your choices? And hell actually is profound testimony to the meaningfulness of your choices, because it means that you're suffering the consequences for the choices that you made in this life. So it underlines how important they are. But if life simply ends at the grave, it doesn't matter what choices you make, whether you lived as an Adolf Hitler or as a Florence Nightingale, makes no difference. You all end up the same. So I agree with you. Existentially or personally, it would be much better to be annihilated than to live in hell, but that doesn't speak to the question of the conditions necessary for life to be meaningful, valuable, and purposeful.
I asked this question from a critic of looking at Christianity from the outside, and that is looking, and it's maybe a critique of the God that you Christians talk about, and that is you apologize to the world and talk and defend why there is a God, or you make arguments for the existence of God, but your very own doctrine also says they already believe in God. So why does God ask you to argue for him that he exists when the people that you're talking to already believe that anyway?
Mm-hmm. Well, what the Scripture says is that people can know that God exists from his handiwork in nature. Well, I take it that that is an endorsement of reasoning to God from nature. And so when I present an argument for God's existence, it seems to me that I am simply appealing to something that the Scripture ratifies doing. And I gave some examples of where Scripture does that. He hasn't left himself without a witness.
Well, my question is, I don't know if I made it clear, that you had said from Romans, and I know other arguments say, people already believe that there is a God, and that's why they're guilty. In Romans, it says even so every man in his heart knows of the knowledge of God. So why would God ask you to go argue to that person when he already believes that there is a God?
Yeah.
You see, I'm saying, it seems you're preaching to the choir, because man in his heart already knows that there is God, and yet he asks us to go talk and defend that he
Well,
he
I
doesn't.
guess I think that when you give arguments for God's existence, it's a kind of extension of general revelation. You are responding to the atheist objections and reasons that they give as to why they don't think that God exists, despite his handiwork in nature. So I suppose you could just say to him, you know very good and well God exists, you can see his existence in nature, and I think that's true. But the reasons that I gave in my first lecture as to the value of apologetics, I think, would still hold. It would still help to shape culture, it would still strengthen believers, and it would still be useful with some unbelievers who, perhaps because of their sinfulness, haven't recognized God's handiwork in nature, but who would be helped by an argument for God's existence.
Dr. Craig, what effects have the studies in the philosophy of language have on terms such as meaning, value, and purpose? And the reason I ask is I work with a person who's studied Wittgenstein and says, well, and I've used these arguments, well, life has no meaning. Well, that's just a language game.
Yeah, I'd have to hear that cashed out. Obviously, philosophy of language does study the notion of meaning, and there are various theories of meaning. This is what semantics does, is it studies meaning. And when I speak of meaning here, I'm not using it in the semantic sense, like the meaning of sentences. I'm using it in the sense that I defined at the beginning, a sort of existential significance, more in the sense of what does it matter? And I don't think that that's impacted by semantical theories about the meaning of language. So I'm puzzled by the objection. I'd have to hear more what the fellow is getting at. It seems to me that either life is ultimately significant and valuable and important, or it's not, and I can't see some third way out of that.
There's quite a bit of powerful existential novels, literature out there that makes the same points. I was wondering if you have any favorite particular novel or something that you would recommend to pass on to a non-Christian that would have this impact, because sometimes when I talk to them, they just don't get the, what do you mean, meaning, They don't really get the effect of it, that would be expressed in a novel or a short
Well,
story.
my favorite novel, although I'm not sure this would be so great for recommending to someone because it's so long, would be The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. I think this is just a tour de force showing the absurdity of life without God and how if God does exist, then things really matter. It's just a masterpiece, one of the greatest pieces of literature ever written, The Brothers Karamazov. But for something shorter, maybe Jean-Paul Sartre's story, The Wall, the short story, The Wall, is very powerful story, illustrating just how absurd life is and how meaningless it is. Or some of the existentialist literature, theater of the absurd, some of that, those plays, for example, Samuel Beckett's plays, can be very powerful, and they're difficult to read because they are so mind-numbing, but some of Sartre's short stories and plays would be very good, I think. No Exit by Sartre would be another, I think.
Sam Harris is The End of Faith. He describes himself as a moral realist, even though he's an atheist. Seems like he is trying to ground the objectivity of morality somehow within an evolutionary biological framework that we haven't developed the science yet to be able to apprehend these truths. But over time, we will develop the science that basically are revealing these, I guess, epiphenomenal type of, arise out of our DNA. Is the right way to really kind of respond to that in the most succinct way is that it's really a category error, the way he is approaching the ontological nature of right and wrong? Is that the best way to think about it?
Yes, and we'll return to this question when we get to the moral argument for God's existence. But I think you're quite correct in saying he's just talking about a different category. That will give you objectivity in the sense that it's rooted in your genes, but it's not values. It's not moral values. All it is a certain behavior pattern that's ingrained into you by your genetic conditioning and societal pressures. So that just as in an ant heap, the worker ants will slave away and even sacrifice their life for the sake of the ant heap, they're not acting in any moral sense. It's not a moral value. It's just a behavior pattern ingrained into them by evolution. And we could say the same thing about the herd morality exhibited by Homo sapiens. So I would say, yes, if there is no God, you're exactly right, but that's not morality. That's a category mistake to think that that has anything to do with real right and wrong or good and evil. All right, well, let's take a break now, and then we'll come back for our third section.